On October 9, 1942, 20,000 feet above a jungle island called Guadalcanal, a 22-year-old American pilot named Marion Carl was fighting for his life. He was flying a Grumman F4F Wildcat, a short and heavy carrier-based fighter, and he was being hunted. His enemy was a Mitsubishi A6M-0, a plane so light and agile it seemed like something from the future. It could turn inside the Wildcat's radius twice over. It could climb like a rocket. For a year, the Zero had ruled the skies from Pearl Harbor to the Philippines, a ghost that no one could touch. Marion Carl was an ace, but right now, he was just prey. The Zero was closing in behind him. He pushed his Wildcat into a dive. The heavy American plane picked up speed, but the Zero stayed right on him. He rolled hard to the right. The Wildcat followed, but sluggishly, like it was moving through syrup. The Zero was already there, predicting his move, its cannons flashing. Carl's cockpit burst apart. Shrapnel tore through his leg and his controls went dead. The plane started to fall. Somehow, he managed to bail out, landing in shark-filled waters, saved only by luck. This was the reality of the Pacific Air War. This was Guadalcanal, not a battlefield, but a meat grinder, where American pilots were being fed one by one into the jaws of the Japanese war machine. The press back home called them the Cactus Air Force. The pilots themselves called their base, Henderson Field, the graveyard. The issue wasn't just the Zero, it was the tactics. The experts back in America had one rule: never turn with a Zero. Use speed, use armor, dive, fire, and escape. But in the wild, chaotic dogfights over Guadalcanal, that doctrine was getting pilots killed daily. The Japanese flyers were veterans. They had fought over China, over Pearl Harbor. They knew their planes by heart. They tricked Americans into turning fights. They knew the Wildcat was slow to roll and exactly where to hit it. The Americans were being crushed. What the Cactus Air Force didn't know, what the Japanese couldn't imagine, was that the answer was already coming. It wasn't a new fighter. It wasn't a new tactic from Washington. It was a 27-year-old farmer, a man so ordinary he'd been told he was too old to fly in combat. A man who'd learned to aim not in flight school, but by shooting jackrabbits on the frozen plains of South Dakota. This is the story of Joseph J. Foss, and the simple, forgotten farmer's trick that made him America's ace of aces. To understand how one farmer could terrify the Japanese Air Force, you first have to understand the farm. Foss wasn't a career soldier. He was born in 1915 on a remote, unelectrified farm near Sioux Falls, South Dakota. His childhood wasn't spent in classrooms. It was lived in the dirt, the cold, and the wind. This was a true David versus Goliath story, like that of Simo Häyhä. But Foss's Goliath wasn't just the enemy, it was life itself. The Great Depression hit South Dakota like a storm of artillery. The land dried up, crops failed, and his family had nothing. Foss's toughness, his Finnish sisu, was forged from survival. He and his father hunted to keep food on the table. And that's where the secret skill began. When 12-year-old Joe Foss hunted jackrabbits, he didn't have a scope. Just an old shotgun, and one rule from his father: don't waste shells. A jackrabbit doesn't run straight. It weaves, dodges, and doubles back. To hit it, you couldn't aim where it was. You had to aim where it would be. That's called deflection shooting. While other kids studied math, Foss was calculating lead, wind, and speed in his head in a split second. He wasn't just a good shot, he was a natural hunter. He understood the art of hitting a moving target. That became his true aiming system, his edge, a skill no manual could ever teach. But Foss didn't want to stay on the farm. He wanted to fly. In 1933, his father took him to an air show where Marine Corps biplanes roared overhead. Joe was 18, and from that moment, he knew what he wanted. "That's what I'm going to do," he told his father. But the path ahead was impossible. He was poor, undereducated, and when his father was killed by a fallen power line, Joe, at just 19, had to leave school to run the farm. He was trapped, but not broken. With that same sisu, he worked the fields by day and took night classes. It took him 6 years to earn enough credits for college. He washed dishes to afford flying lessons and finally earned his pilot's license. Then came Pearl Harbor. Joe Foss was 26. He rushed to enlist as a Navy pilot and was rejected. He was too old. In 1941, the cutoff for fighter pilots was 25. They told him he could only instruct others how to fly. It was crushing, like being told by an engineer that your dream was within limits. The system said he didn't belong in combat. So Foss did what stubborn men do. He broke the rules. He found a way in. He joined the Marine Corps Reserve, became an instructor, and for 9 long months watched as the 20-year-olds he trained went off to war without him. It infuriated him. He pushed his commanders, wrote letters, demanded combat duty. He became, in his own words, the loudest, most annoying instructor in the Navy. Eventually, they gave in, just to get rid of him. He was sent to advanced fighter training and assigned to a new unit, VMF 121. And in October 1942, as Marion Carl was falling from the sky, 27-year-old Grandpa Joe Foss was on his way to the front. The too-old farmer from South Dakota was put on a transport ship. His destination, Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. What awaited him there wasn't a military base. It was hell. The moment he stepped off the plane, the smell hit him. A thick, choking mix of engine oil, rotting jungle, and death. The runway was nothing more than a rough strip of dirt and gravel carved from the palms. The operations center was a wooden shack called the Pagoda. The pilot's quarters were mud-floored tents, and everywhere he looked were wrecks, twisted remains of F4F Wildcats and P-39s pushed aside, their wings ripped off, their engines shattered, their cockpits dark with old blood. This was the graveyard of the Cactus Air Force. Foss was assigned to his tent and met the men he'd be flying with. They weren't the eager young recruits he'd once trained. They were ghosts. Their faces were yellow from atabrine, the bitter anti-malaria drug. Their eyes were bloodshot from exhaustion. Their flight suits were soaked with sweat and grease. They were veterans, but they were hunted. When Foss, the old man, the farmer, walked in, they looked him over. He was new meat, another replacement for the one who'd been lost yesterday. He went to inspect his plane, a Grumman F4F Wildcat, the same model Marion Carl had been shot down in. It was heavy, clumsy, slow, a coffin with wings against the nimble Zero. The squadron's executive officer, a man named Duke, gave him the standard briefing, the same one that was getting pilots killed. Never turn with a Zero, ever. Foss listened and nodded. He understood the rule, but he also understood something else the manuals didn't. He understood jackrabbits. The next morning, Foss flew his first mission. He was heading straight into the kill zone, a farmer in a flying coffin, about to face the most advanced fighter on Earth, armed only with a trick born in the fields of South Dakota. His first flight over Guadalcanal wasn't training. It was trial by fire. He climbed to 15,000 feet, scanning the endless blue. The veterans had warned him. They come out of the sun. You don't see them until they're firing. Foss led his first patrol, tense, feeling blind. Then the radio crackled. Bandits, 11 o'clock high. He looked up and saw them. A formation of Mitsubishi Zeros diving at terrifying speed. He remembered the order. Never turn, dive, and run. He shoved the stick forward and threw his Wildcat into a screaming dive. The heavy plane gained speed, but the Zeros stayed right with him. One opened fire, tracers slicing past his canopy close enough to make him wince. He kept diving, straight down to the jungle canopy, shaking them off his tail. When he finally leveled out and returned to Henderson Field, his hands were trembling, not from fear, but from anger. The doctrine was wrong, and he knew it. You couldn't win by running away. That only kept you alive a little longer. Joe Foss hadn't come here to survive. He had come here to hunt. On October 13th, just days after his arrival, Foss led another patrol. This time, they met a formation of Japanese bombers escorted by Zeros. The sky erupted into chaos, Wildcats and Zeros twisting, diving and climbing in a deadly dance. Foss spotted a Zero closing fast on his wingman's tail, ready for the kill. The rulebook said to dive away and find an easier fight. But the farmer's instinct said otherwise. Foss rolled his Wildcat sharply. He wasn't aiming at the Zero itself. He was aiming at where it was going to be. He squeezed the trigger, and his 650 caliber machine guns thundered. A long 3-second burst tore through the air. Not at the enemy plane, but at an empty patch of blue 200 feet ahead of it. It looked like a miss, a wasted shot, but the Japanese pilot, focused on his prey, didn't see Foss. He swung his plane into a perfect tight turn, straight into the stream of bullets. The Zero's wing tore off in an instant, and the plane vanished in fire and smoke. It was Foss's first kill. He hadn't outturned the Zero. He hadn't outrun it. He had outthought it, using the simple, forgotten logic of a farmer that the experts back home had ignored. When he landed at Henderson Field, the ghosts of the squadron gathered around him. He had scored his first victory. He told his crew chief, "This plane's a truck, but it's a tough truck, and it shoots straight." To his fellow pilots, he said, "Forget what they told you. Don't chase them. Lead them. Lead them until you think you'll miss. Then lead them more. They'll fly right into it." This was the mental modification, the piano wire logic, the iron sight instinct. It wasn't a change to the aircraft. It was a change in thinking. It was a farmer's confidence. The pilots listened. They were desperate. Their ace, Marion Carl, was still recovering. They needed someone to follow, and this 27-year-old farmer was the only one talking about hunting instead of running. Foss took command of his small group of 8 Wildcats, a ragtag bunch of replacements and newcomers. They had no fancy nickname, but the press watching this older pilot lead his misfit squadron gave them one: Foss's Flying Circus. And on October 16th, the Circus went to work. Foss led his 8 planes straight into a formation of 32 Japanese fighters. 32-8. Suicide odds. But Foss had a plan. He wasn't going to dogfight. He was going to use farmer's logic. He ordered his men to use the thatch weave, a new tactic where 2 planes flew in pairs, covering each other's tails. Foss dove in, spotted a Zero, didn't turn, just pulled lead and fired. The Zero exploded. Another dove for him. Foss's wingman rolled and blasted it off his tail. The Circus moved like one machine. In just 10 minutes of brutal, swirling combat, Foss's flight of 8 shot down 5 Japanese planes. Foss himself got 2. The Circus returned to base, all 8 planes still flying. The graveyard was suddenly alive again, and then the numbers began to climb. Fast. Faster than anyone thought possible. It was Simo Heiha's kill count all over again. October 18th, Foss downed 2 more. October 20th, another. By October 23rd, just 10 days after his first victory, Joe Foss was already an ace with 5 confirmed kills. On October 25th, he shot down 3 Zeros in a single day. The old man, the farmer from South Dakota, had become the most dangerous pilot on Guadalcanal. He wasn't just flying, he was leading. Foss's Flying Circus now ruled the island's skies. But, like Simo Heiha, that kind of success came with a cost. The Japanese were furious. They were losing planes faster than they could replace them. Their best pilots were being taken down by slow, outdated Wildcats. It didn't make sense. And the name that kept coming through their radio intercepts was the same: Foss. The Japanese high command took notice. Just as the Soviets had noticed Simo, the Japanese aces began to focus on one target. The war became personal. They weren't fighting wildcats anymore. They were hunting Foss and his flying circus. On November 7th, Foss led his flight when they were ambushed by an elite group of Japanese aces. The sky turned into a storm of tracers and explosions. Foss shot down 2 Zeros and was about to line up a third when cannon fire tore through his plane from behind. His engine exploded. The cockpit filled with smoke. He was going down. Foss managed to bail out just before his Wildcat crashed into the jungle below. He was shaken but alive, rescued and returned to base. 2 days later, he was back in the air. This time, he went after a Japanese float plane. He focused so hard on his target that he didn't see the gunner in the back. The gunner opened fire, shredding Foss's engine. For the second time in 3 days, his plane was dead. But now he was over the ocean. Foss ditched his Wildcat in the water. It hit hard and sank within 30 seconds. He was left floating alone, 10 miles from shore, in one of the most shark-infested stretches of the Pacific. The farmer's toughness, his sisu, kicked in. He stayed calm. He'd waded through storms before. He knew how to endure. But then he saw them. Fins. Dozens. Sharks circling closer. Bumping him. Brushing against his legs. The man who had hunted Zeros was now being hunted by something far older. Foss had no weapon, no radio, just grit. For 4 endless hours, he floated, surrounded, refusing to give up. As the sun began to set, a small canoe appeared on the horizon. Inside were native islanders sent by an Australian coast watcher who had spotted Foss's crash purely by chance. They paddled toward him, beating the water with their oars to drive the sharks away. They pulled the freezing, exhausted pilot from the sea. When they brought him back to Henderson Field, he was a wreck. His body was weak from exposure, and he was burning up with malaria. The doctors grounded him immediately. Joe Foss, America's new ace of aces, was confined to a hospital bed. His flying circus had to carry on without him. The Japanese assumed he was dead. The ghost of Guadalcanal, they thought, was finally gone. But they were wrong. For 2 weeks, Foss lay there shivering with fever, his body fighting to recover, his mind chasing the same thought. The jackrabbits were getting away. When he finally regained his strength, he climbed out of that bed, walked straight to the airfield, and into a new Wildcat. On November 30th, he went hunting again. He shot down another Zero. The ghost had returned, and this time he was angry. The Japanese threw everything they had at him, but Foss kept coming. By January 15, 1943, his kill count stood at 23. He was just 3 victories away from the all-time American record, 26, set by World War I legend Eddie Rickenbacker. That number was sacred, untouchable. And now, a 27-year-old farmer from South Dakota, flying what pilots called a flying coffin, was about to break it. By early 1943, the name Joe Foss was legend on Guadalcanal, but that legend was built on exhaustion and fever. The too-old farmer was falling apart. The malaria had returned with a vengeance. Foss flew with a burning fever every day. Ground crews would watch him land, his Wildcat riddled with bullet holes, shaking so violently from chills they'd have to lift him from the cockpit, drenched in sweat. He was fighting 2 wars, one in the skies against Japan and one in his own blood against the parasite. And he was winning both. His tally held at 23. The number to beat, 26, wasn't just a record. It was a mountain, a symbol of ultimate American mastery in the air. For 20 years, no one had even come close. And now, a half-delirious farm boy flying a battered Wildcat was climbing that mountain 1 bullet at a time. January 15, 1943. Foss was sicker than ever. The doctors had forbidden him to fly. He ignored them. He dragged himself into the cockpit, head pounding, vision blurry. Word had spread. A massive Tokyo Express convoy was approaching, guarded by waves of Japanese fighters. Foss and his flying circus were ordered to intercept. The sky filled with planes. The largest battle Foss had ever seen. Zeros and Wildcats spun and dove through a storm of fire and smoke. Feverish and barely conscious, Foss fell back on instinct, back on the lessons of the farm. He saw a Zero locking onto a wingman. He didn't think, he acted. He rolled his Wildcat, not at the Zero itself, but at the empty space where it would be. He fired. The .50 calibers ripped through open air, and seconds later, the Zero flew straight into the wall of bullets and shattered apart. That was kill number 24. Foss scanned the chaos. Another Zero was diving toward a group of Wildcats. Foss shoved his throttle forward, the engine screaming at its limit. He cut across the Zero's path. The Japanese pilot spotted him and tried the usual Zero tactic, a tight turn to outmaneuver his opponent. But Foss didn't take the bait. Instead, he pulled a high-side pass, a move he'd practiced again and again. He rolled over the top of the Zero, dropped down through its blind spot, and fired one clean burst. The Zero's engine erupted in flames. That was kill number 25. He had tied Eddie Rickenbacker's legendary record. Joe Foss was now officially a living legend, but he wasn't finished. Across the sky, he saw another enemy, a roof float plane fighter trying to flee the chaos. Foss dove after it. The roof pilot spotted him and yanked his plane into a desperate climbing turn. It was the ultimate test. A veteran Japanese ace versus the farmer's eye. Foss didn't chase blindly. He calculated. He watched the roof's arc, predicting its escape path. Then, with calm precision, he lifted his nose and fired a long, sweeping deflection shot that seemed almost impossible. The stream of .50 caliber bullets curved through the air and met the roof exactly where it was heading. The rounds tore through its cockpit. The plane spiraled down, flipping end over end before slamming into the Pacific. That was kill number 26. In one feverish afternoon, Joe Foss, burning with malaria, had shot down 3 enemy aircraft and shattered the unbreakable record. When he landed his battered Wildcat at Henderson Field, the entire base was waiting. The graveyard had turned into a field of triumph. The worn-out pilots of the Cactus Air Force cheered as they pulled their too-old farmer from the cockpit and carried him on their shoulders. Joe Foss was, without question, America's ace of aces. But as the Americans celebrated, the Japanese high command in Rabaul fell into silence. This was their Saburo Sakai moment, their wake-up call. For months, Japanese pilots had ruled the skies with total confidence. They flew the A6M-0, a masterpiece of engineering. They were veterans, masters of aerial combat, and they believed the Wildcat was hopelessly inferior. Their doctrine was simple: force the Wildcat into a turn, get behind it, and destroy it. Then came Foss and his flying circus, and suddenly the doctrine stopped working. Battle-hardened pilots returned to their carriers pale-faced and shaken. They told confused intelligence officers the same strange story. They'd dive on a Wildcat expecting it to run, but it didn't. They'd bait it into a turn, but it refused. Instead, the American plane would roll, dive, or climb unpredictably, fire its guns seemingly into empty air. And seconds later, the Zero beside them would explode. They couldn't explain it. They were being hunted by something alien, a logic born not in flight schools or manuals, but in the frozen plains of South Dakota. Joe Foss had done what Simo Häyhä once did on land. He had stripped the enemy of every advantage they thought they had, himself invisible by hiding his breath and the glint of his scope. Foss did the same, but in the air. He made his intentions invisible by never aiming directly at his target. The Japanese pilots weren't fighting a man anymore. They were fighting a ghost, an invisible modification that wasn't built from metal or piano wire, but from the mind of a South Dakota hunter. Foss had shattered their confidence. He proved that the mighty Zero wasn't unbeatable, that the inferior Wildcat, in the hands of a man who understood the science of a jackrabbit's movement, could be the deadliest weapon in the sky. The Japanese aces, who once hunted wildcats for sport, were now hesitant. They were cautious. The Cactus Air Force was no longer the hunted. It was the hunter. And it all came down to one man they said was too old to fight. But victory always comes with a cost. For Simo Häyhä, it was a single explosive bullet. For Joe Foss, it was something slower, a painful, consuming breakdown. Days after breaking the record, Foss was grounded for good. The malaria finally won. His body was failing. Constant fever, unbearable weakness. He had lost more than 30 pounds. The man who faced zeros and sharks was now being destroyed from within. There was no victory parade when he left Guadalcanal. He was carried away on a stretcher, a pale, skeletal shadow of himself. Evacuated through hospitals in the Pacific and then to the U.S., Foss was both a hero and an invalid. But Joe Foss still had that sisu, the stubborn strength of the farmer. Months passed in a San Diego naval hospital before he could stand again. And there, America finally honored him. On May 18, 1943, Joe Foss, the farm boy from South Dakota, stood in the White House as President Franklin D. Roosevelt placed the Medal of Honor around his neck. The citation spoke of his courage and unmatched skill in combat. But what was his real legacy? What was the ripple of that farmer's logic? It was hope. In 1942, America was losing the war. The Zero was a legend. The Japanese Air Force seemed unstoppable. Joe Foss, with 26 kills in 44 days, shattered that myth. He proved that an American farm boy, flying an American plane, could beat the best in the world. He didn't just write a new chapter in air combat, he rewrote the entire manual. The deflection shooting and thatch weave tactics he perfected became the foundation of Pacific air strategy. He helped save Guadalcanal, and in doing so, helped turn the tide of the war. And what became of the Ace of Aces when the war ended? Unlike Sergeant McKenna, whose modification stayed secret, Foss's heroism was celebrated nationwide. Yet like Simo Häyhä, he never forgot his roots. He left the military and returned home to South Dakota. Using his fame for good, he entered politics, winning a seat in the state legislature. And in 1954, that same farmer who had once been told he wasn't good enough became the governor of South Dakota. He served his state with the same devotion he'd shown in war, later becoming the first commissioner of the American Football League, a respected and beloved figure. But at his core, he remained the same man, the farmer who understood the raw, simple logic of the hunt. Because wars aren't truly won by experts or engineers reading manuals. They're won by individuals who see the flaw and fix it. James McKenna saw a flaw in a P-38's control cable, 3/8 of slack that meant death, and fixed it with a 6-inch piece of piano wire. Simo Häyhä saw a flaw in sniper doctrine, the glint of a scope, and replaced it with simple iron sights. And Joe Foss, the farm boy, saw a flaw in the Wildcat, that you couldn't outturn a Zero, but you could outthink it. He fixed it not with tools, but with instinct, the farmer's eye he'd trained all his life. These are the forgotten pages, stories of the men who broke the rules to win. Joe Foss died in 2003 at the age of 87, buried with full military honors, a hero of his nation, a legend of the Marine Corps, and a testament to the unbreakable sisu of the American farmer. If you found this story as powerful as we did, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us bring more forgotten stories from World War II. War II to life. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Every one of them matters. Everyone deserves to be remembered. And we'd love to hear from you. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Our community stretches from Texas to Tasmania, from veterans to history lovers. You're part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.